Welcome back to Introduction to Survey Research. Today I'm going to talk about the early prehistory of survey research. What are the origins of the survey as a research method and the ideas that underlie it? Survey research is really a creation of the 20th century. It especially blossomed in the period from about 1935 to 1950. Today we're going to focus on the precursors to the modern sample surveys. That includes the problem of representative method and of sampling, the development of attitude scales in psychology and how those were applied to systematic questions in surveys, and the rise of government and academic survey organizations. How did government come to use the survey method? So today we're going to focus on those precursors to the modern survey. There are many early things that we might consider surveys, but by the modern standards we would not call them surveys. Most notably, the census. One of the earliest, the Doomsday Book of William the Conqueror, was done in 1086. It was a census of landowners that measured how much land and livestock they owned and what the value of that was. It was primarily a census done for the purposes of taxes and knowing how much taxes to collect. Another very prominent census example, of course, is in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, Clause 3, which calls for an enumeration of the population, and that enumeration will be the basis of representation in Congress and for tax collection. Margot Anderson, one of the preeminent scholars of the history of the census, speaks, for example, of how this census represented the first example of statistical data being collected for the purposes of political power and representation. Other census scholars talk about how the census over the lifetime of the country provides a record of the evolving history of our country and the use of data to tell stories about that history. But that doesn't constitute a survey or a sample in our modern sense. To see one of the early examples of the use of survey as a term, we need to go back to the late 1800s and Charles Booth, who lived from 1840 to 1916, but whose principal work was The Life and Labor of the People in London, which he published in 17 volumes between 1889 and 1903. This was the first English social survey, as they came to be called. And one interesting aspect of the use of the word survey here is the direct analogy to a land survey, an overview that examines and explains the boundaries of a population in this case. Booth's work represented both a collection of empirical evidence and a social enterprise aimed at the betterment of society, a concern both for facts but also for the conditions of poverty and social problems, with the goal of ameliorating them, or at the very least understanding them in their degree of prominence and importance. While others had earlier done house-to-house canvasses, some as early as the 1840s, and studies of mortality and epidemics actually go back to the 1660s, Booth's effort was unique both for its size, its breadth, and its temporal scope, conducted over a number of years. Some of his earliest reports of this work was presented in the 1887 to 1889, which he presented at the Royal Statistical Society, in which, among other things, he discovered that 1 Londoner in 3 is living in poverty. Well over 1 million people. Part of what he addressed in that study was that these poverty-ridden people were not primarily drunkards or beggars who refused to work, a notion that was prominent in social thought at the time, but rather they were poor because they either lacked enough work or they were overwhelmed by sickness, debt, injury, or too many mouths to feed in the family. Among other findings, he showed that charity was not enough to affect the poor. What giving there was and what efforts of the church existed left barely a dent in the level of poverty reaching to a third of the population of the city. One of the elements that Booth developed in his social survey was to distinguish degrees of poverty, really an early precursor to modern survey measurements which try to order degrees of some variable in a survey question. In his case, he distinguished, among other things, a line of poverty, which was regular though bare income, 18 to 21 shillings a week for a moderate family. Next were the real poor who struggled to obtain the necessities of life, and then the very poor who lived in a state of chronic want or even outright distress. His actual categorization was even more extensive than that, with 8 levels of poverty and economic conditions, including wealth, actually. And one of the features of his study was to produce a map of the City of London with 8 colors representing the full categorization of class distinctions in the city, and mapping them onto a physical map, a geographic display of the city. In this, Booth represents some of the earliest examples of linking social data collected through surveys to geographic data representing the distribution of those characteristics in the population. In that, we see again a precursor to modern efforts of geographic mapping, geographic information systems, which combine data collected on individuals through a survey with data on geographic areas and the regions or areas of a city and how those link to one another. So in this, Booth was really very much a precursor of the modern approach to mapping sociological characteristics, psychological characteristics. The other element in Booth's work that stands clearly is his concern for public policy, if we want to think of it that way. That while his researches were empirical and efforts to come up with true facts about the population, they were also directed at a normative goal, the effort of changing the nature of society, affecting the level of poverty in the society, and so on. So in this, I think Booth was again a major precursor of modern survey techniques, but public policy making as well. So where was Booth not a modern survey researcher? Well, first, his work was not based on a random sample, but rather an eclectic collection of statistics and observations. Some participant observation. Booth rented a room in a poor neighborhood. Interviews with people called school board visitors. These were attendance officers who visited school children's homes regularly. And Booth used those visitors as, in effect, his eyes and ears, and used their observations of poverty to estimate many of his data and collections. Through this, though, he managed to cover some 80% of households in much of the city. He also used a wide number of other indicators, from business conditions to surveys of particular streets, and classified people by occupation, their number of children, and so on. So that's Booth. We will come back in a moment with the second part of this lecture and move ahead from there.